Awful weather out there. You wanna go inside the diner?
No, I don't want anyone to see me like this.
You're not gonna like these. It's what you thought.
On a dark, rainy day in the fall of 1986, Hella Crafts learned from a private investigator that her husband was having an affair.
Is that your husband?
Yes. That's Richard.
Shortly after this meeting, Hella Crafts disappeared. This is the story of how forensic science solved the puzzle.
I first met Hella Crafts in the fall of 1986. She came in to see me and was discussing the possibility of a divorce from her husband. She was very concerned about what was happening at that time. She was also concerned about potential violence, shall we say.
By all accounts, 39-year-old Hella Crafts was a caring mother of 3 young children in an unhappy marriage.
She strongly suspected the affair. She felt she knew who the individual was, but she really wanted some confirmation. So we talked about hiring a detective to prove that, in fact, yes, he was involved with another woman at that time.
It was a typical scenario of husband is never home, constantly lying about his whereabouts. And she had had enough.
When Hella Crafts hired Detective Keith Mayo, she provided an important lead, a long-distance number she saw on the phone bills but didn't recognize.
I met with her several days after we had caught Richard with his girlfriend. And there were many photos of affection between the two of them. Her kissing him and holding his hand and rubbing his back, those types of photos.
Yes, Richard.
She just broke down. She cried for at least 5 or 10 minutes, just sobbing.
Hella and Richard Crafts had been married for 12 years. They both worked for the airlines, Hella as a flight attendant for Pan Am, Richard a pilot for Eastern Airlines. He was also a part-time policeman.
I would describe him as, he was very cold. You know, when he looked at you, he had a very cold stare.
Their relationship was not a close one, and friends say Richard sometimes hit Hella.
Dearest Mother, here I am again in London. I have said to Richard, I want to be divorced. I no longer trust in Richard. Hugs, Hella.
After Hella filed for divorce, she confided in friends on her flight crew.
I want to tell you something I told my lawyer. If anything ever happens to me, don't think it was an accident.
It was an accident, and that's an unusual comment to get from a client.
On November 18th, 1986, Hella returned from a European flight assignment and was dropped off at home by her best friend. It was the last time anyone saw her. A few days later, Hella missed her next flight assignment. She didn't call in, so friends called the Crafts home. Richard said she went to Denmark to visit her sick mother. Later, he told a different story, that Hella was on vacation with a friend.
All which proved not to be true. And when this all came together, one started talking to the next, there was a collective sense of panic in short time.
The friends were basically telling me that she had disappeared. and that she was not the type of individual who would do this. She had 3 small children. So I called Keith Mayo.
I immediately told Diane that I thought we should go over to the Newtown Police Department to report her missing. And they just turned a deaf ear on us.
So Mayo launched his own investigation. In this home video, the Crafts' live-in nanny talks about some mysterious dark stain she noticed on the carpet shortly after Hella disappeared.
In the inside of the bedroom door, there was a spot, a black spot?
Yeah.
How big would you say it was?
Half this big.
How, about that big?
Yeah.
Did it look like a stain?
It looked like it was stained, but it hadn't been there before.
The fact that there was new carpet in the master bedroom and Richard ripped up the carpet and wouldn't give the nanny an explanation as to why.
Also suspicious, a large freezer missing from the garage. And credit card receipts showed that Richard had rented a commercial wood chipper right after Hella disappeared. Had something happened to Hella inside the house, and was her husband involved? Police asked Richard Crafts to take a lie detector test.
Did you kill your wife?
No.
Do you know your wife's whereabouts?
No.
Did you have anyone kill your wife?
No.
Showed very little reaction at all. There was nothing that either my partner saw or I saw that indicated that he was lying.
With Hella Crafts still missing and no leads, Connecticut State Police called in their secret weapon, forensic expert Dr. Henry Lee. Dr. Henry Lee is the director of the Connecticut State Police Forensics Laboratory and one of the world's most respected forensic experts. He accompanied police as they searched the Crafts' home.
We examined some piece of physical evidence and found some tiny clue.
On the mattress, Dr. Lee discovered 5 tiny stains, so small they could barely be seen. Could they hold the key to the disappearance of Hella Crafts? An orthotolidine solution on the mattress fibers turned blue. It was blood. A species test proved it was human blood. But was it Hella's? An antigen test revealed type O positive, the same type as Hella Crafts. And microscopic analysis revealed it was circulation blood and not menstrual.
If a circulation blood, now which means a blood vessel has to be injured to create such a pattern.
Dr. Lee studied the angle and intensity of the blood's impact. He concluded the blood hit the mattress at an angle of 10 degrees, meaning it came from an individual leaning over the bed or kneeling. The blood was moving through the air at medium velocity, consistent with an injury caused by a blunt object, and there was a 6-inch blood smear on the side of the mattress. The bathroom towels had been washed recently, but Dr. Lee tested them with an orthotolidine solution. The blue areas proved the towels had been soaked with blood.
The next issue, of course, a human body cannot just vanish in the air. A body has to be someplace.
But there was no body, no weapon, and no witnesses. Police needed more to go on. So they looked for any unusual events that might somehow be connected to Hella Crafts' disappearance. It led to an important break. It snowed the week of Hella's disappearance. A snowplow driver reported seeing a wood chipper on a bridge about 3:30 in the morning. A man briefly appeared, wearing an orange poncho. He saw the same wood chipper again on River Road about an hour later.
I said, well, take this man to the location, to the exact location where he saw the wood chipper.
It was here, where the Housatonic River runs into Lake Zoar. Police searched the riverbank. All they found were a few mounds of wood chips. But when they took a closer look, they found a piece of an envelope. It was mail, addressed to Miss Hella L. Crafts.
They were just laying there, you know, and I thought, good Lord, you know, I didn't even think too much about how the chipper came into play at that point until we started finding a lot of hair. That was when I remarked to my boss, I said, if he did what I think he did, it's time for me to retire.
Police spent days sifting through the dirt and debris along the riverbank. In addition to the letter and blonde hair, they also discovered a few blue fibers, a gray piece of metal, what looked to be some tiny bone fragments, and another piece of evidence which just appeared.
The sun had melted the snow away from this wall, and right against the wall, laying right on top of the leaves, a painted fingernail.
Divers explored the bottom of the river and found pieces of a chainsaw. Even more unusual, the serial number had been scratched off. Everything was taken to the State Police Forensic Laboratory in Meriden, Connecticut.
Because any investigation involves so many specialty areas, that's why we start calling in forensic team.
By now, the story was front-page news around the world. Richard Crafts was a suspect, but he maintained his innocence, saying he didn't kill his wife, he didn't know her whereabouts, and that he had passed a lie detector test. But the forensics might tell a different story. When Dr. Lee convened the first meeting of his forensic team, he knew they faced a difficult task.
They need either that piece of paper from me that says somebody's dead, or occasionally a huge pile of evidence to convince them.
To identify the individual became a scientific challenge.
They began by examining every notch of the chainsaw and found some human hair, tissue, and a minute piece of fiber.
In size, it was barely visible with the naked eye on the cutting edge of the chain.
The fiber was a bluish-green cotton, the same color as Hella's favorite cotton nightshirt, and it matched other blue fibers found at the river. But since the serial number was scratched away, it was impossible to tell who owned the chainsaw, or was it?
By using a particular chemical solution, that will eat away the upper layers of the metal that have been altered by the water or by some physical attempts to alter the serial number.
It worked. The serial number on the chainsaw, 59211616. It matched the warranty card sent in by Richard B. Crafts. Next, forensic experts wanted to find out whose hair was on the chainsaw and at the river. Every one of the 2,660 hairs was examined under a microscope.
A lot of the hairs had been cut, but not cut with a scissors.
Did it belong to Hella Crafts?
So we have to find some known hair to compare. Basically, we use our hairbrush.
There was a characteristic that is somewhat unusual for head hair, and that's a ridge that was present in the head hairs.
They concluded that the hairs found on the chainsaw and at the river were microscopically similar to the hair from Hella's hairbrush. Next, they turned their attention to the fingernail with the bright red nail polish. A chemist compared it to a bottle of Hella's fingernail polish found in her home, analyzing the various organic compounds. These graphs show that the polish on the fingernail found at the river is the same as polish taken from the bottle found on Hella's nightstand. Good forensic work determined that the fingernail polish and the hair were both similar to Hella's, but they couldn't prove she was dead.
I received a phone call from Dr. Lee asking me if I would come and take a look at these little pieces of what he thought to be bone, and he wanted me to see if I could identify them in any way.
Dr. Lee suspected that the bones found at the river had gone through the wood chipper Crafts had rented. So Dr. Lee got the same machine and ran a test. This is actual footage. A pig was put through the chipper, since their skin and bones are similar to humans. Dr. Lee noticed that the chipper produced a unique signature type of cut, one that matched the cutting pattern on the debris found at the river.
What I was presented with were these very, very tiny, literally millimeter-sized fragments of bone. And in amongst some of these fragments, it was possible to see that some of the fragments indeed came from a human.
Under a spectrograph, Dr. Harper noticed tiny grooves in the bones. The grooves told a story. They were formed by blood vessels inside the top of the skull, something only humans have. They also identified skull fragments from the side of the head. And these were the most important from a forensic point of view.
So if the fracture is beveling outwards, we know the force came from the inside. We know it was a whole lot of force. So we didn't know if that's what killed her. We didn't know if she was dead before it happened. But we certainly knew she was dead afterwards. Okay. So now we know a human being is dead. The next question is, who?
Dr. Harper froze some of the bone fragments with liquid nitrogen, then ground them to a fine powder. Tests revealed the bones came from an individual with type O positive blood, Hella Craft's blood type. Finally, Dr. Lee turned his attention to the gray piece of metal believed to be a crown to a tooth.
But there was no human remains on that crown, so that couldn't be used as a form of identification.
They needed more. So Dr. Lee asked Dr. Karazoulis himself to go to the river where he searched for 5 days. Then, a break.
I'd been at the crime scene for maybe 8 hours. I slipped and fell into the brook. And I had a pail and I was picking evidence up. And I cleaned my hand off in this pail that I was collecting evidence in. When I came into the tent, I put all the contents of the pail down. I washed my hand and I looked down and there was the tooth.
But was it Hella Craft's?
And I was able to match all the years of different x-rays. I imagine it was from 1986 back to 1982. So I had no doubt in my mind that the tooth I found came from Hella Craft's mouth.
Finally, the forensic team had an actual match.
And they say, Hella Craft's teeth are in this pile. And they were knocked out of her head violently. And we have a human head going through violent injury in the same pile. So we said, that means Hella Craft is dead. Period.
Based on the forensic evidence, Richard Crafts was arrested and charged in the murder of his wife. What happened to Hella Crafts? Based on the forensic evidence, a reasonable scenario can be pieced together.
Hey, thanks for the ride.
On November 18th, Hella Crafts returned from her flight to Germany around 7 p.m. She put the children to bed around 8. The nanny had the night off and wasn't expected home until midnight. Before going to bed, Hella changed into her favorite blue nightshirt, looked through her mail, stuffed it into her pocket, and began changing her sheets.
I don't believe you. You know, I can't take this anymore. Why don't you just get out?
No, you get out.
You get out. Leave me alone.
Then it happened quickly. Using a police flashlight, the first blow knocked her to the ground. The second produced the blood splatter, hitting the mattress at a 10-degree angle. While falling, her head grazed the side of the mattress, leaving the blood smear. He wrapped the body in the bed covers, carried her through the house into the garage, and placed the body into a freezer. Richard tried to clean up the blood with some towels which were later washed, but traces of blood remained on the towels, later discovered by Dr. Lee. Marie Thomas, the nanny, arrived home around 2 a.m. and went right to bed. At daybreak, Crafts took the children and the nanny to his sister's house, saying their mother had left earlier.
Hurry! Hurry up!
He then rented the largest commercial wood chipper he could find and a U-Haul truck, using his credit card. By nighttime, Hella's body was completely frozen. Crafts transported the remains, along with a chainsaw and some wood, to the river. The snowplow driver spotted the wood chipper on a bridge around 3:30 in the morning, and again near the river an hour later. Using his chainsaw, Crafts dismembered Hella's frozen body and put the pieces through the chipper along with some wood. Since the body was frozen, it produced little, if any, blood splatter. Most of the debris blew into the river. Only a few pieces fell short, landing on the bank. The mail Hella placed in her nightshirt pocket passed through the chipper, virtually untouched. Before leaving, Crafts took apart the chainsaw, scratched the serial number off, and threw the pieces into the river. How close was the brutal murder of Hella Crafts to the perfect crime?
Boy, damn close. Damn close.
And if that person truly believes they're not going to be caught and there's no fear or threat to them, they could get by a polygraph test. The key solving this case is so-called teamwork. Assemble a good team and work together.
Amazing. The human body writes so much of its history in itself.
At the Dallas Pistol and Revolver Club in 1991, Trey Cooley, a young spectator, was watching a shooting competition seated behind an air gun range. He was struck and killed by a stray bullet. This is how ballistics, lasers, and forensic animation solved the riddle of the magic bullet. "14-year-old Trey Cooley. Look at him and you see the all-American boy." Trey attended Bowles Junior High School in Arlington, Texas, near Dallas. He played cello in the school orchestra, played baseball, and was a Boy Scout.
At that age, every kid has the whole world open to him. He could have done anything he wanted to do.
Most of all, he enjoyed spending time with his family. Trey and his father, Butch, were best friends.
We did everything together.
September 29, 1991. Butch Cooley woke early that Saturday morning, then went to wake Trey. The two shared a passion for shooting. Butch was judging a competition. He gave Trey a choice to sleep in or tag along. Trey chose to go with his father.
Trey started shooting when he was 7. He enjoyed it. Shot his first deer when he was 8. He wanted to be a pistol competitor.
And he was pretty good at it.
At the Dallas Pistol and Revolver Club, Trey volunteered to help out by running results from judges to the official scorer. In between assignments, he sat in the airgun building to get out of the hot Texas sun. He sat just inside the door near two women who were working as scorers. But behind people shooting air pistols, nothing more than pellet and BB guns. Then, a blood-curdling scream. Trey Cooley slumped to the floor, blood flowing from his temple. His baseball cap had a tiny but telltale hole. Butch Cooley was outside the building, just a few yards from his son when he heard the screaming. Although Butch Cooley spent 21 years as a state trooper and was trained to handle emergencies, no training could prepare him for what he saw next.
When I got there, I saw that he'd been shot. I checked his pulse. I knew it wasn't good.
Butch walked in and I asked him, "What are you doing home?" And I said, "Well, where is Trey?" And then he came in and he told me, he said, "There's been an accident." And I was thinking, well, he's cut his foot or cut his hand or broke his arm, And I said, "Well, that's okay. He'll be okay."
Trey was rushed by ambulance to Parkland Memorial Hospital in Dallas.
He was just laying there. He was breathing, or the machine was breathing for him. His little hands were still warm. And he just looked like he was asleep.
6 hours later, Trey died.
I just wanted to tell him that I was very, very proud of him. I loved him dearly.
My only son. My best friend. My fishing buddy. My hunting partner. Just a void.
Trey Cooley was seated in the club's designated safety area. It was an accident that shouldn't have happened. Detective Tom Pease and crime investigator David Taylor had a tough job to figure out where the bullet that killed Trey Cooley came from and to determine if the shooting was accidental or intentional. Butch Cooley spent 2 decades as a state trooper. Was it possible the shooting had something to do with an enemy he possibly made during his tenure? Or had the bullet come from outside, from one of the outdoor shooting ranges, or possibly the nearby railroad tracks where kids had a history of taking shots at the airgun building?
The biggest problem with this range, or this scene, was the size of it. It wasn't contained inside a house, inside an apartment. It was outside and it covered several hundred feet.
The bullet removed from Trey's skull would provide some answers and raise new questions. The bullet was small, about ½ an inch long, but lethal. Larry Fletcher is the firearms expert who conducted the ballistics examination.
The bullet was not that damaged. The bullet was in rather remarkable condition.
This is a .45 caliber bullet after striking a cement wall. It is badly mangled, especially when compared to the bullet that killed Trey Cooley. That lack of damage could be telling, except for one thing. This was not a typical .45 caliber bullet.
This particular bullet is a hand-loaded or hand-made bullet. It's not a commercial-made bullet in which they can add other materials to the lead and make it much harder. It can withstand a lot of damage upon impact.
Who makes and uses these types of bullets? Butch Cooley knew.
Competitive shooters like to load their own ammunition. Primary reason being the cost savings.
Most of the competitive shooters on the outside ranges that day were using handmade bullets, so there was little doubt that the bullet came from somewhere here rather than from kids on the railroad tracks. Police collected the weapons and ammunition samples from the shooters in the competition. When Larry Fletcher examined the bullets used that day on the outside ranges, he noticed something else.
The powder charge, which increased the velocity of this particular type of bullet.
Basically, the shooters used bullets with more gunpowder. More gunpowder means these bullets travel farther and faster than a regular .45 caliber bullet. Fletcher's next task was to match the bullet that killed Trey to one of about a dozen guns. Each of the guns from the shooting competition were test-fired and compared to the bullet taken from Trey Cooley's skull. Fletcher had trouble getting an exact match because the extra gunpowder created extremely high temperatures during the firing of the gun, actually melting some of the distinguishing marks. But Fletcher noticed a red wax on the bullet that killed Trey. All shooters use a lubricating wax, but only one of the guns used a red wax. Larry Fletcher found the gun that fired the fatal shot.
At that point, I was pretty much convinced.
A pistol competitor named Dan Smith was using that gun on the day of the competition. And he was firing on this outdoor range, just behind the airgun building. But Smith told police he couldn't have fired the fatal shot.
He felt that all his shots had made the target, that there were no errant rounds.
But something just didn't add up to Butch Cooley. He spent his entire life around guns and won awards for marksmanship and gun safety. He knew shooting ranges are supposed to be safe. Accidents aren't supposed to happen. It just didn't make sense. Police were satisfied that Trey Cooley's death was an accident. The ballistics report said the fatal bullet came from a gun fired from an outdoor range during the competition. But how? The owner of the gun said he didn't miss a shot, and the range was designed to contain any errant bullet. First, there's a barrier between the airgun building and the firing range. It's called a berm. It's a small mountain of dirt, about 12 feet high. The berm sits right behind the targets in the event a shooter misses either to the left or right. Directly above the targets are a series of wooden planks fastened end to end and side by side. These are called baffles and are designed to catch bullets fired a little high of the target before they leave the range. Then there are two additional sets of baffles, one just a few yards in front of the firing line, and another called an eyebrow directly over the firing line. Ken Buster is a safety management consultant with years of experience as a shooter and with a special expertise in firing ranges.
Between the eyebrow, the baffles, and the height of the berm, the vast majority of any stray bullet would be stopped.
Safety should be the number one priority in everybody's mind anytime that you participate in marksmanship as a sport. Something was wrong there.
Butch Cooley began a personal crusade to learn the truth. He needed to know how a bullet could bypass the range's safety features and kill his only son. Butch hired attorney Mike Schmidt to find out where or if the safety system had failed. Schmidt put together an investigative team. Steve Irwin was the first member. As an accident reconstructionist, his job was to create an exact, computerized, three-dimensional scale model of the airgun building and the firing ranges. Using laser technology, precision measuring devices, and sophisticated computer programs, Irwin would also uncover the path of the bullet.
You wind up starting at, unfortunately, the young boy getting shot, and then working your way backwards.
Police had already identified some important clues. The outside wall of the airgun building was riddled with bullet holes from all angles. Irwin needed to know exactly which one was the culprit. Police also found bullet holes inside the building, in a sheetrock strip to protect a lighting fixture, and in a wall that separated the indoor range from a storage shed. There was also a fresh gouge in an ordinary ceiling tile. Irwin's laser survey equipment traced the bullet's path from where Trey was sitting through all those points, from Trey, through the sheetrock strip, off the ceiling tile, and through the back wall. It seemed unlikely, but it matched the evidence.
It was roughly a straight line, but I couldn't see from the interior wall to the exterior wall. And it wasn't until we got it back to the office and got it mapped that it formed this remarkably straight line.
A straight line that led directly to one of the bullet holes in the aluminum siding, then down to the shooting range behind the airgun building. It led to the range where Dan Smith was shooting, but oddly enough, not to the firing line. The laser pinpointed a path that landed 10 yards in front of the firing line. When Ken Buster was brought into the investigation, he immediately inspected the firing range to see if there was any way a bullet could get past all of the range's safety features. Buster delivered a scathing report.
At the time and now, I still think that was the worst range that I have ever seen.
He found dozens of potentially deadly safety flaws.
The berm separating the back range from the front range was not the standard height, which is supposed to be 20 feet.
The berm behind the airgun building was only 12 feet high. The baffles were far below standard. The wooden planks should have had a steel or concrete backing. And look closely at the planks themselves. They had separated, leaving big gaps. A bullet could easily pass through.
In this case, the baffle might well has not have been there and served no purpose at all.
And Buster was appalled by the bullet holes in the back of the building.
Several of these holes had been plugged. That means to me, as a safety person, as a range person, as a longtime shooter, that they knew that bullets were getting out of that range, and they accepted that fact and continued to shoot.
The laser analysis projected the bullet path to the middle of the outdoor range, well in front of the firing line. How could this be? It was due to a monumental blunder. During the competition, shooters were required to fire from several distances. First, from the firing line at 25 yards. Then they moved forward to 20 yards. And finally, to 15 yards. The laser study showed that the fatal bullet was fired from the 15-yard line. The architectural model shows the problem clearly. By firing from the 15-yard line, shooters had to move in front of the eyebrow and the first set of protective baffles. And Irwin's computer also showed another frightening reality. From the 15-yard line, you could see the back of the airgun building.
If you can see it, you can shoot it. And any projectile that might leave the range in that area was going to hit that building.
The laser showed the bullet flew under the last baffle, over the berm, and into the building. It involved a bizarre trajectory. It meant that the shooter missed the target high and to the left by more than 5 feet, a terrible miss. How could a trained marksman miss a target by that much from only 15 yards away? Part of that answer was found in the gun itself. Close examination revealed it had been modified.
It's like taking a standard car and making a hot rod.
Some competitive shooters file down parts of the gun to make it easier to pull the trigger quickly.
They've got it set to where they go off so easily. They fire 2 rounds instead of 1. It feeds so fast.
The result is called doubling, which sometimes occurs as the gun recoils. A recoil is the backward force created by the explosion pushing the gun up in the air. Each type of gun recoils differently.
A .45 creates a recoil up and to the left.
Kirk Parks had the task of producing the computerized proof, a fact-based animation of what happened. His firm specializes in forensic animation. Parks videotaped hundreds of .45 caliber pistol shots using the same type pistol and ammunition. He used this footage to create an exact computerized reproduction of the recoil for the animation.
We shot the video from the top of the weapon, and we shot it from the side, and we shot it from the front.
Next, Parks created wireframe models of a competitive shooter in action, and then animated Irwin's laser studies of the firing range and the bullet path to complete the picture.
It produced the exact results necessary to generate the bullet path that was surveyed, up and to the left.
I can't say for sure that the gun doubled, but all of the evidence seems to indicate that it did, and it fired during the uncontrollable recoil.
This forensic animation was able to show what happened to Trey Cooley on the morning of September 29, 1991. But the animation showed that the bullet took a remarkable journey, one which almost defied belief. When Trey Cooley entered the Dallas Pistol and Revolver Club on September 29, 1991, the range was a tragedy just waiting to strike. Outside on the firing range behind the airgun building, Dan Smith, one of the last competitors of the day, steps up to the 15-yard line. This moves him in front of two sets of safety baffles. Using a modified gun, Smith takes aim and squeezes the trigger. In a fraction of a second, another shot is fired during the recoil phase of the original shot. It happens so quickly, the shooter doesn't know it left the gun. The bullet misses the target high and to the left. Traveling upwards, it passes underneath the last set of protective baffles and just 3 inches over the berm. It's speeding at 1,200 feet per second. The bullet blasts through the aluminum siding, goes through a storage room, misses a broom and some pipes by less than an inch, and then breaks through a second wall, entering the airgun range. Then, the bullet does something unbelievable. It strikes an ordinary ceiling tile, and for some unknown reason, it doesn't blast straight through into the roof. Instead, it skids along the tile for 7 inches before mysteriously changing direction, making a 10-degree turn and begins a downward path. It slows to about 900 feet per second, penetrates a plaster wall, and enters Trey Cooley's head. The Cooley family filed a negligence suit against the gun club and individuals involved with the competition. The judge who presided over the civil case was impressed with the visual and computerized evidence.
I've been on the bench 6.5 years, and I would say that's in the top 2 or 3 or 4 in terms of just the professionalism and the effectiveness of the demonstrative evidence brought into court.
The Cooley's attorney says the forensic animation and model explained this tragedy in a way nothing else could.
I could not have possibly gotten the result that I got on behalf of the Cooley family without them.
The animation also helped Butch Cooley understand what had happened to his son. But there is still little peace for Trey's dad.
What's peace? You just take it a day at a time.
Change just one thing, and Trey Cooley might be alive today. The range.
It wouldn't have happened because I would not have allowed that competition to occur on that particular range.
The gun.
They may not even be aware that it's double firing or slam firing on them. They may think it's properly functioning.
The bullet.
If it had been a softer bullet, they may not have ricocheted as much, would not have had the velocity.
Or if the shooter had been standing at the proper firing line, the shot would have hit the baffle or flown over the building. But why did this fatal bullet change direction as it hit the soft ceiling tile instead of blasting straight through as it did with the hard walls?
Bullets can do incredible things they're not expected to do.
These thoughts haunt Butch Cooley. No explanation can ease the pain felt by a father who woke his son early one September morning.
Should have let him sleep.
On a hot summer evening in 1992, neighbors heard the familiar sound of an argument coming from the Campano residence. According to Christopher Campano, his wife left the house shortly after their argument to calm down.
Get out of here! Go!
Karen Campano was never seen again. Karen Campano was just 2 weeks shy of her 43rd birthday when she disappeared. She had just come back to Oklahoma City after visiting her 3 children who were living in New York. Back to the home she shared with her 3rd husband, Chris.
She come back from New York and she went to talking about moving back because of her family and she's upset.
Chris and Karen Campano were married in December of 1987. Friends described them as an odd couple. She was 15 years older than Chris, and it was her 3rd marriage, his first. They were introduced to one another by Karen's best friend, who also happened to be Chris's mother. Chris was a drifter, worked construction jobs, and spent some time in jail for petty theft. Karen was the main wage earner, working as a bill collector for this credit adjustment company in town. On the evening of July 1st, 1992, Chris and Karen had one of their frequent arguments, this time over his use of drugs.
And I was into drugs and she was, you know, nagging at me and trying to get me in drug programs and, you know, just trying to help.
It was loud enough for the neighbors to hear.
I could hear Karen screaming and no, please, please, and don't do that. And couldn't make out a lot of what was being said, just a lot of screaming.
According to Chris, after the argument, Karen left the house for a walk, headed to the Buy for Less convenience store for some personal items a few blocks away. Chris left too, driving to a local bar for a few drinks, staying until about midnight. The next morning, Chris called Karen's office to see if she had reported to work. Her supervisor said she hadn't shown up or even called in. Chris then phoned the police to report her missing. When the police arrived to take Chris's statement, they looked around briefly and reported seeing no evidence of foul play or anything out of place or unusual.
If a person is going to run away or leave her husband, she's not just going to walk away and leave everything behind. She's going to take the things that mean the most to her, especially when you're dealing with a woman, things of, you know, toiletries, makeup, and that kind of thing. And of course, we found all those things intact in the bedroom and in the bathroom, and it was as if she just disappeared off the face of the earth without taking anything with her.
While the police were there, Chris mentioned that the house had been burglarized the night before while he was out drinking and that some items were missing. Police asked Chris to sign a waiver to allow a search of the house.
And he agreed to do so and thought that would be good, and even commented that he hoped that we found something in the house that would help us with the investigation.
The first thing I recall seeing is the bed was against the south wall, and right next to the bed was a large white trash bag. And underneath that trash bag, I could see a very large brownish colored stain. Of course, the next thing we did was went and got some Hemosticks, which we carried in our vehicle.
A Hemostick is a chemical strip that can immediately tell whether or not blood is present.
Take the dry Hemostick and with your finger just lightly smear it on the suspect stain to where some of it's transferred onto the Hemostick. Take a drop of distilled water, put it on the Hemostick, flick off the excess water, and you have a dark green, which is a positive presumptive test for the presence of blood.
The stain on the carpet was indeed blood. But was it human? And if so, whose was it?
The first day we were in the house, I put on a pair of gloves, and that spot on that carpet was still moist. This piece of carpet and the padding was completely soaked with blood. It was such a massive amount of blood that there was still actual moisture involved there. It was not completely dried.
The carpet was removed and delivered to the Oklahoma City Police Department's forensic chemistry lab.
I went on to do a Octoloni test. Is a species determination test to determine as to whether or not that blood came from a human or an animal source.
It was human blood.
That was enough to convince me that we weren't dealing with a routine missing persons case.
The police needed more to go on and felt the answers lay inside the Campanos' house. When police discovered human blood inside the Campanos' bedroom, they suspected the blood stain might belong to Karen Campano. They also suspected that Chris knew more about her disappearance than he was admitting.
She left at 7:30. Okay, what did you do then?
Under police questioning, Chris maintained that he knew nothing about his wife's whereabouts, but his alibi was weak. The bartender didn't recall seeing Chris Campano on the night of July 1st, and police discovered that Chris had pawned some of Karen's jewelry the morning after her disappearance. Without a body, the only thing left for the police to do was run more tests inside the house. There weren't any visible signs of violence besides the blood stain they found in the bedroom.
We saw a typical little frame house for central Oklahoma City that, as you went inside, looked quite clean, quite neat. Things had been cleaned out of it. The walls looked clean, ceiling looked clean, the floor looked clean. So there wasn't much to see at all.
So they decided to look for blood which may have been cleaned up or wasn't visible to the naked eye. To do so, investigators used a special chemical solution called luminol, an extremely sensitive test which can detect blood which has been removed by water or even detergents and bleach.
Luminol is a fluorescence type chemical. Spray it on a substance that may contain blood. It reacts with the heme group in the blood itself. The iron portions will luminesce or fluoresce.
To do the luminol test, investigators needed complete darkness, so they waited until nightfall. They began their chemical dragnet in the bedroom, where they discovered the stain on the carpet a few days earlier. First, they took photographs of the room, the way it looked to the naked eye. Then they sprayed the luminol. The results were astonishing.
There were some instances in that house where it glowed so brightly that you could actually see the person standing next to you. There was so much blood in there.
The luminol told a horrific tale. Blood had been everywhere. On the walls, the ceiling, on the doors.
It looked like a bloodbath had occurred there, something from a horror movie.
Even more telling was the blood spatter, which is the placement of the stains. Where they were located, the size of the drops and the trails of blood all told a story. Someone had been beaten in the bedroom with a blunt object.
They were in two trails, what we refer to as cast-off trails. So if you had an object, for example, in your hand, and that object was blood-covered, and if you were swinging that object overhead, the centrifugal force of pulling the blood down to the end of the object will cast the blood in the direction the object is being swung. And in this case, it's going to the ceiling. There are two distinct trails, and you can tell that there's at least two swings with the blood-covered object.
Luminol was then applied to the rest of the house and even to the outside steps and walkways.
At one point, there's a swipe of blood that was on the kitchen door leading into the utility room that would have been about head level if you were carrying a body and had to turn the body sideways to get it through a normal door. And then at that point, it appeared the body was laid down on the ground and then drug from the utility room down the back steps.
And you could see pooled luminescence on each step, and then drag marks that were luminescent all the way down the walkway until you got to the point that you were at the driveway, and at that point they disappeared. Very, very dramatic presentation.
The house was telling its story. one of an apparently gruesome attack. But there were still unanswered questions. Where was the body? And the weapon? And was the blood Karen Campano's? Police still couldn't prove a murder had been committed. Although the police knew someone was violently attacked inside the Campano residence, they couldn't be sure a homicide had been committed. Was there enough blood in the Campano house to prove that someone was dead? And was that someone Karen Campano?
The investigators at a later time decided that we'd go back and try to do a measurement test to see how much blood had to have been let out on that carpet to make that size of a stain.
Police made sure their test was as accurate as possible. They used a piece of the original carpet as well as a weight to simulate a human head. Next, they poured human blood around the weight until they created a stain measuring 887 square inches, the same size stain they originally discovered.
Statistically, one could say that between 1,300 and 1,400 cc's of blood would create that stain.
That's more than 40% of the blood volume of a woman Karen Campano's size. No one could survive with that amount of blood loss.
So at that point, it became pretty apparent to me that if this lady was missing and if this lady was dead, that this lady probably was killed right there.
The authorities now knew a homicide had been committed in the house and that someone had died in the bedroom in a pool of blood. But was the victim Karen Campano? Police didn't have a sample of Karen Campano's blood to compare to the blood stain. If Karen's mother and father were still living, it would have been a simple matter to examine their DNA, since Karen would have received half of her DNA from her mother and half from her father, but Karen's father was deceased. The Oklahoma City Police Department asked the FBI to get involved to see if there was any way they could figure out whether the blood found in the house belonged to Karen Campano. The police obtained blood samples from Karen's mother, her 2 sisters, her 3 children, and one of her ex-husbands.
And so in this particular case, the object of the examination was to see if this DNA from the bloodstain of unknown origin was matching, at least half of the DNA was matching to the relatives from Karen Campano.
Hal Dedman of the FBI's DNA analysis unit conducted what is called RFLP analysis, analyzing pieces of DNA from 4 different chromosomes. This is the DNA profile of Karen Campano's mother. And next to it, on either side, are 2 of her daughters, Karen Campano's sisters. Both daughters share half of their DNA with their mother. This lane shows a DNA sample from one of Karen Campano's ex-husbands. The next lane shows a sample from his son, whose mother was Karen Campano. The father and son both share the upper band. The son would have received the lower band from his mother, which matches the band from his grandmother, Karen's mother. The next autorad compares the family member's DNA to the unknown blood stain found in the Campano home. The top marker matches the genetic profile from the first of Karen Campano's children. And the markers from the blood stain also matched the bands from Karen Campano's 2 other children from another marriage.
Results were fairly straightforward. They were totally consistent with the blood coming from Karen Campano.
8 months after the disappearance of Karen Campano, police concluded that Christopher Campano murdered his wife and was arrested. All of the evidence pointed towards Chris Campano. The forensic evidence, the argument neighbors heard on the night of Karen's disappearance, Chris's lack of an alibi for the entire evening, and the fact that he pawned some of her things. The prosecution believed that Karen Campano never left her house for a walk, as her husband had suggested. Neighbors heard Karen and Chris arguing that night, and the forensic evidence suggests that the argument moved to their bedroom, where it escalated and turned violent. As Chris stood near the window, he struck Karen in the head with a blunt object, at least 3 times, possibly more, producing the cast-off blood trails on the ceiling and walls. Karen fell to the floor, her head striking the bedpost where her blood was also found. As Karen lay bleeding from her massive head injuries, Chris left and went to a local bar. He needed to wait until the neighbors were asleep before removing Karen's body. When he returned home, he wrapped Karen's body in a sheet with a telephone wire and carried her through the house. Luminol test showed that Karen's head brushed against the door, leaving a blood smear, later cleaned with detergent. Chris then dropped the body onto the floor and dragged it through the side door and out towards the car. He probably disposed of her body late that night in a deserted location. After returning home, Chris removed all visible traces of blood both inside and out. The DNA analysis showed the blood found on the carpet belonged to Karen Campano. And the medical examiner would testify that Karen Campano suffered horrendous head injuries during the attack which no one could survive. Prosecutors were confident of a conviction, even though they didn't have a body or a murder weapon.
Well, I thought it was very likely we might never find the body of the victim.
But just as the preliminary hearing was set to get underway, everything changed. The police found Karen Campano.
This part right here wasn't quite so grown up with all this ivy, and she was laying right down there by that large cottonwood tree, north to south, and there were some blankets around her. There was no greenery at that time. If there had been greenery at that time, you'd never know she was there.
The body lay in a remote area off a major interstate highway until some youngsters on dirt bikes stumbled across it.
All we knew was that we had a female's body out there. We had no idea who it was. Of course, we were hoping it was Karen, but we didn't know.
There was another important find. Police discovered a piece of a check underneath the body. Although they couldn't determine to whom the check was issued, it was from the Shell Oil Company and mailed to someone in New York. The check was for $83.34. Karen Campano was from New York, and her family had a part interest in a gas station there.
This was the first definitive piece that we had, that we knew at that point there was a great possibility that it was Karen. And of course we wouldn't know for sure until they made identification through dental records and DNA.
Dr. Tom Glass heads the Forensic Odontology Department at the University of Oklahoma. With the help of Karen Campano's dental records and an almost complete set of teeth found in the skull of the body, Dr. Glass's task was fairly easy.
What I do in making the comparison then is simply go frame by frame by frame of the patient's ante-mortem dental x-rays, the x-rays made by the dentist, with the frames of the same areas made on the skeletonized remains. She had a very thorough dentist who documented what he had done. And that documentation allowed the identification in Karen Campano's case to be very profound.
And a DNA analysis of the bone marrow confirmed it. The last doubts had been removed.
Personally, I'm glad she was eventually found because of the family back in New York. I talked to them at length over the phone. Later on during the investigation, I met them. They're really great people, and I really had strong feelings for them, hoping one day she would be found so they could put their own fears to rest and give her a decent burial.
And Christopher Campano confessed. The remarkable thing about it, the autopsy confirmed the prosecution's theory of how Karen died. And that theory, remember, was based only on the luminol, the blood spatter analysis, and the blood volume tests.
The maxilla were fractured, the mandibles were fractured, the nose was fractured, the sinuses were fractured, the skull was extensively fractured, yet the cervical spine was intact and there were only 3 fractures in the ribs. So this is not the hallmark of somebody that's been run over by a car or somebody who's had a train wreck or something like that. This is the hallmark of someone who has sustained a severe beating about the head and face. So it was obvious that this was an assault.
Police and forensic science had solved a difficult puzzle.
It all told a story. It was just more of the pieces of the puzzle coming together, even all the way to the end when the body was actually found. It's like, you know, we've got most of the puzzle there. You know what it is. Even with some missing pieces, you know what it is. But then with that body found, it was like that was the very last piece that just fit in there.
In January of 1994, a year and a half after Karen was killed, Christopher Campano went on trial for his life. His defense attorney couldn't refute the forensic findings. They were just too strong.
Once I had decided to make that leap and embrace the evidence, then my task became easier. It was a matter then of looking at the psychological aspects of the case rather than the hard forensics of the case. I suggested to the judge and jury if it was going to be deliberately planned out and methodical, that kind of blood wouldn't be there. There would be none in the house probably. The homicide would have occurred elsewhere if it had been a cold-blooded killing.
The jury bought at least part of the argument. It found Campano guilty of manslaughter, not the first-degree murder charge the state was seeking.
I feel sorry for it. I feel sorry for what I did to her. Can't bring her back, you know. I just got to pay for what I've done.
Christopher Campano was sentenced to 1,000 years in prison. On a deserted footpath, early on the morning of November 22nd, 1983, a hospital worker witnessed a terrible sight. It would be the first case in the world where DNA evidence helped find the killer. Narborough, England, a quiet little village of about 6,000 residents, where violent crime is almost unheard of.
It is something you expect to happen in a city, not in a small village community.
15-year-old Linda Mann was a typical teenager, quiet but popular. She liked school and enjoyed being with friends. On a cold November evening, Linda left her home in Narborough to walk the mile or so to her friend's house. When Linda didn't return home by midnight, her frantic parents called the police. Early the next morning, her semi-nude body was discovered along a secluded footpath known locally as the Black Pad. Detective David Baker was called to the scene.
Her clothing was in a state of disarray, her jeans removed, and her underclothes were strewn about. It was a cold night and she'd got a scarf around her neck, and the scarf had been used to strangle her.
She was very brutally attacked, sexually assaulted.
Word of Linda's murder traveled quickly in the otherwise quiet village.
The people were horrified. I'm very worried, particularly those with young girls, young daughters.
A search of the crime scene turned up little of substance, but the autopsy provided some important clues about Linda Mann's last moments alive.
The absence of injury to her private parts, and also generally on her body, there was very little injury to her, would suggest that it was not a violent attack and that she may have died very quickly.
The conclusion was that she was strangled and then raped.
A semen sample taken from Linda's body turned out to be an extremely important piece of evidence. It came from an individual with type A blood and a PGM1+ enzyme profile. But this matched 10% of the adult male population in England. Since Linda Mann's body was found only a few hundred yards from a local psychiatric hospital, some speculated that the killer may have been a patient. Others weren't so sure.
The thing that I was very anxious to establish was that it was unlikely to have been a psychiatric patient from the hospital. It was much more likely to be a man leading a normal life, perhaps with a family, certainly one who had friends, relatives, and contacts who thought of him as a normal individual.
Linda Mann was in the wrong place at the wrong time.
Former cop turned author Joseph Wambaugh wrote a best-selling book entitled The Blooding. It chronicles the events surrounding the murder of Linda Mann and the history-making investigation which would follow.
It's very unusual, and still is, in a village like Narborough in Britain, for a complete stranger to ambush and murder someone on a footpath. I mean, it was so unheard of.
Police questioned thousands of people about Linda Mann's whereabouts on the night she was killed.
They put more into a murder investigation over there, which they call an inquiry, than we do here, because they have so few murders compared to us.
Linda Mann was buried in a churchyard not far from where she was murdered. On the day of her funeral, police set up a surveillance and videotaped the crowd for anything or anyone unusual.
Often one finds that criminals will revisit the scene of the crime or some other activity associated with the crime, and it was just a precaution.
Today, police issued a new poster to try to jog people's memories.
But it was of little help. The investigation dragged on for months, then a year. With no eyewitnesses, few strong leads, and several false trails, the murder hunt hit a dead end.
Well, really, in any police investigation, after a week or two, the trail is usually cold. It's quite difficult.
We suffer all the time.
Yes, please come forward.
All along, Linda's parents held out hope that the killer of their daughter would be caught.
The only thing that they could possibly get now was justice for their daughter, and that seemed to be going away from them.
It's always frustrating when you've not got an answer to a problem, and I mean you're forever looking over your shoulder, to see what you've missed, and then trying to guess what might happen in the future.
And the search for Linda Mann's killer continued for the next 3 years. Three years had passed since the murder of Linda Mann, and life in the small village of Narborough was beginning to return to normal. Until the afternoon of July 31st, 1986. Another 15-year-old schoolgirl, Dawn Ashworth, was walking home from her part-time job at a newsstand. Instead of taking the main road, she took a shortcut down a thickly overgrown footpath called 10-Pound Lane. When Dawn didn't return home by 9:30 that night, her parents called the police. Another teenage girl was missing.
Dawn Ashworth went missing last night.
We've all hoped and prayed that this was not a repeat of the Linda Mann case, yes.
2 days later, police discovered Dawn Ashworth's nude body under some heavy brush and hay. She was discovered less than a mile from where Linda Mann was murdered 3 years earlier. Like Linda Mann, Dawn Ashworth had been strangled and sexually assaulted.
Dawn had quite marked injuries to her genital area, which would indicate it was a very violent attack. And her injuries elsewhere in the body would also indicate that she had suffered violent injury, therefore she'd been attacked violently, which would indicate that she had put up a fair struggle before she died.
Semen samples taken during Dawn's autopsy revealed that the attacker had the same blood type as Linda Mann's murderer. There were other similarities as well.
There were signature elements in the crime, certainly. Both murders took place on footpaths. Both girls were teenagers. Both girls were walking alone.
Both manually strangled, both severely sexually assaulted.
All schoolgirls were advised to travel in groups and not to walk anywhere alone. Dawn Ashworth's father had given his daughter the same advice.
I warned her and warned her about the dangers of going down there on her own.
We've got to find the fiend, really, that did this to my daughter, to our daughter, and stop it from happening again.
Police launched an extensive investigation into the murder of Dawn Ashworth, and within a week, police got a break. Witnesses saw a young man in the vicinity of 10 Pound Lane on the afternoon of Dawn Ashworth's death. He was 17-year-old Richard Buckland, a kitchen worker at the psychiatric hospital, located just a few hundred yards from where both Linda Mann and Dawn Ashworth had been murdered. Police brought him in for questioning, and he quickly became their prime suspect. For one thing, he knew details of the murder which weren't in the newspapers.
In addition to that, when we'd questioned Mr. Buckland, he couldn't really account for his movements on that particular afternoon.
If I were working on the case, I probably would have become very suspicious, given the things he told the police, given his background, given his reputation around the village for liking to scare girls as they're walking home from school, things like that.
Finally, after 15 grueling hours of interrogation, Richard Buckland confessed to the rape and murder of Dawn Ashworth. Police finally had their man. Given the similarities between the two murders, police were convinced that Buckland also raped and murdered Linda Mann 3 years earlier. Buckland denied it. Was he telling the truth? The answer lay just a few miles away, in a university laboratory. Richard Buckland confessed to killing Dawn Ashworth, but insisted he had nothing to do with the murder of Linda Mann 3 years earlier. Police were convinced he was lying and set out to find the truth here at the University of Leicester, ironically less than 10 miles away from where both teenagers were murdered. Dr. Alec Jeffreys, a geneticist, had been researching hereditary diseases when he accidentally discovered an amazing technique called DNA, or genetic profiling.
There was a case of eureka. You could see individual identification. You could see parentage analysis, paternity disputes, sorting out immigration cases.
David Baker said, well, look, let's cement the case against this young man. Let's go to this geneticist at Leicester University, this Dr. Alec Jeffreys, and take the semen samples from both murders and cement our case with this new thing called genetic fingerprinting, whatever it is, and let's just prove that he did both of them, because we know he must have done both of them.
Dr. Jeffreys wasn't sure that he could do what Baker wanted, because this sort of analysis had never been done before. Dr. Jeffreys' breakthrough technique for analyzing DNA is called restriction fragment length polymorphism, or RFLP. It can identify an individual based on just a small amount of their DNA. DNA that can come from semen, blood, hair roots, and other cells. DNA is a complex chemical which is present in all living cells. It's a little like a computer program, containing coded instructions on how to make a human being. No two individuals have the same DNA pattern, except for identical twins. Dr. Jeffries' task was to take the semen recovered from Linda Mann and Dawn Ashworth and compare it to the blood sample from Richard Buckland to see if it was a match. First, white blood cells from Richard Buckland's blood sample were treated with a special chemical solution that allows the DNA, a sticky white substance, to float free. Next, the DNA is cut into smaller pieces using special proteins called restriction enzymes, which act like chemical scissors. The DNA fragments must then be sorted out by a process called electrophoresis. The DNA is marked with a radioactive dye and placed in separate lanes on an electrophoretic gel. Then it's subjected to an electric field. Under ultraviolet light, you can see how the electrical current draws the negatively charged fragments through the gel to the positive end of the tray. The separated fragments are then visualized on X-ray film called an autoradiogram, which resembles a barcode, showing an individual's unique genetic makeup. Dr. Jeffries first used this technique to resolve an immigration case and after that a paternity dispute. But this would be the first time it was ever attempted in a criminal case to reveal the identity of a double murderer.
Let's start with Linda Mann. This is her DNA profile taken from her hair. Next track is a mixture of semen and vaginal fluid from that victim, showing her DNA profile as expected, plus a single man semen DNA profile. Next victim, Dawn Ashworth. This is her blood DNA profile, a band here and another one off to the left. Trace amounts of semen recovered from that victim, both revealed 2 faint bands, whose position on the autoradiograph is very similar to the semen profile seen from Linda Mann. So, first conclusion, both girls have been raped and therefore presumably murdered by the same man. What about the prime suspect, Richard Buckland? This is his blood DNA profile here and here, completely different from the semen profile. Conclusion, both girls have been raped and therefore presumably murdered by the same man, and that man was not the prime suspect, Richard Buckland.
The result shocked the police.
It was a blow to us.
They basically didn't believe a word that we were saying, and that was quite right. Healthy skepticism of an entirely new technology. And indeed, I didn't believe the results myself, so we did retesting. The testing was done, again, independently by Home Office forensic scientists, all pointing to the same conclusion, namely that Buckland was not the guilty party in this case.
After 4 months in custody, Richard Buckland was released and became the first person in the world to be exonerated of murder through the use of DNA profiling.
I have no doubt whatsoever that he would have been found guilty had it not been for the DNA evidence. He would have been jailed for life. I mean, that was a remarkable occurrence.
But why did Richard Buckland confess to a crime he didn't commit?
Then the pressure started getting really hard. Just didn't have a chance.
He had to have discovered the body himself, because in the terms of his confession he was able to give a very detailed description of her clothing, where the body was, in what position it lay, the ligature and so on, details that nobody could possibly know unless they'd actually seen the body.
With Buckland now out of the picture, a double murderer was still loose.
And of course the next stage was for David Baker then to make what I think was an incredibly courageous decision.
A DNA manhunt. Police sent letters to all men between the ages of 13 and 33 living in the villages of Narborough and Enderby. The letter asked each man to volunteer for a blood and saliva test.
I'm sure they expected that the real killer, if he was indeed a resident of the villages, would probably try to escape responsibility of giving a blood sample.
DNA testing would only be performed on those who had the same blood type as the killer, which was about 10%.
And it was really an attempt to try and flush out the guilty party.
Which is what it did.
But not the way police had hoped. The trap was now set. a DNA manhunt to flush out the killer of Linda Mann and Dawn Ashworth. It was a bold plan. More than 5,000 men voluntarily gave blood and saliva samples. But one worker at this local bakery didn't. His name was Colin Pitchfork and was already known to police for earlier convictions for indecent exposure. He didn't want any further involvement with the police, so he persuaded co-worker Ian Kelly to take the blood test for him. Kelly lived outside the area and wasn't asked to take the test himself. Kelly was the perfect foil.
Pitchfork spun him a yarn that he'd already given blood on behalf of somebody else who couldn't go because he was wanted by the police, etc., etc. And Kelly ostensibly swallowed that hook, line and sinker.
Since police required identification before taking a blood sample, Kelly needed some photographic proof he was Colin Pitchfork. They both went down to a photo booth and took a passport-sized photo of Ian Kelly. Pitchfork took his own passport, slit the plastic casing with a razor blade, and neatly inserted Kelly's photo in its place.
The police failed to observe that a photograph had been substituted for the original one, and therefore they believed that this was Colin Pitchfork, and there was his picture to prove it.
Perfect. Ian Kelly then took the blood test for Colin Pitchfork. Of the more than 5,000 men who voluntarily gave blood and saliva samples, none matched the profile of the murderer. But no one could anticipate what would happen next. On a summer's evening, 1 year after Dawn Ashworth was found brutally raped and murdered, Ian Kelly joined fellow bakery workers at this local pub. And the conversation turned to the DNA manhunt. A young woman in the group overheard Kelly bragging that he had taken the blood test for Colin Pitchfork.
She sat there and listened to that and thought to herself, there's something not right about this. This isn't something that someone normally does, no matter how afraid he is of the police. And so she put in a call to the Leicestershire murder inquiry team, and that's what made them focus on Colin Pitchfork.
Police quickly located Pitchfork to question him about the blood test and what he might know about the two murders. Within a very short time, he confessed to killing both Linda Mann and Dawn Ashworth.
Pitchfork believed in DNA fingerprinting right away. Not that he knew any more about it than the rest of the world, but he'd been following it in the newspapers, and he believed in it. And he knew that it was as good as an inked fingerprint, and he knew he was finished when they arrested him. So he confessed quite readily.
Without this breakthrough, the chances are the police would have never caught Pitchfork. And I think it's fairly clear that had he not been caught, then he would have killed and killed and killed again.
Colin Pitchfork was 27 years old, married with 2 children. His wife had no idea she was married to a serial killer.
I think he was able to deceive her perfectly well, so that nobody in the whole world knew that he was the guilty person.
It's the same story. The wife, the brother, the mother, the friends of serial killers never suspect that they could be serial killers.
On January 22nd, 1988, Colin Pitchfork became the first person ever to be convicted in a murder case solved by DNA profiling, and was sentenced to life in prison. For his part in the deception, Ian Kelly was convicted of conspiracy to pervert justice and sentenced to an 18-month prison sentence, which was suspended. He served no time for his crime.
What you did? I was wrong for doing what I did.
I think we've learnt a lot from the deaths of both of these 2 girls. Certainly the scientific advances that have been made with DNA has spread itself now throughout the world.
It was this case of all cases on which DNA really cut its teeth in a forensic sense.
The door has been opened to a whole new aspect of medical investigation.
People will be talking about this case 100 years from now, not because of my book, but because of Alec Jeffrey's discovery.
Early one morning, in a deserted area outside of Phoenix, a motorcyclist discovered the body of a young woman. She had been beaten, bound, strangled, and possibly raped. The surrounding plants would tell more about her killer than any other single piece of evidence. When investigators from the sheriff's department arrived at the crime scene, they gathered every possible piece of evidence. The victim was nude except for a pulled-up tank top and a t-shirt wrapped around her neck, which was probably used to strangle her. Her wrists and ankles were loosely bound with shoelaces and what looked like picture-hanging wire. Nearby, investigators found a syringe, some articles of clothing. Then they heard some evidence. It was a pager, found deep in the grass a few feet from the body. The discovery of the pager triggered a larger search, and the photographer took some aerial photographs. There appeared to be a circular area of matted grass where an altercation possibly took place. Police took the victim's remains to the medical examiner for identification and autopsy. A fingerprint search identified the victim as 30-year-old Denise Johnson, a single mother of 2 young children. She was born and raised in an area of Phoenix known as the Projects.
She wasn't a bad girl. Some of her friends, I think she got with the wrong friends. I ain't gonna say they made her do these things now.
She hung around with people that liked to party, drink, and I don't really know what they were doing, but she was out there in the world with people that did drugs, I'm sure, and sometimes I think she trusted too much.
Denise made her living on the streets of Phoenix. She had a history of shortchanging truck drivers in various drug deals at local truck stops, which earned her the nickname Twist Mama.
Her friends cautioned her that her lifestyle was probably going to find her in a lot of trouble someday, and eventually it did.
But who ended Denise Johnson's life? The investigation began with the pager found lying near the body. It belonged to this man, a local trucker named Mark Bogan. He said that on his way home from work the night before, he stopped to make a phone call. That's when he met Denise Johnson for the first time.
Hi, how you doing?
Hello there.
Bogan said she asked for a ride to the interstate.
Why not?
Thanks.
Once inside the truck, she made some sexual advances. They pulled off the road and had consensual sex in the cab of his truck. Afterwards, as he was dropping her off, he said she attempted to steal some of his things off the dashboard.
Oh, I had a really good time.
So did I, baby.
Did you?
Oh, always when I'm in the company of a lovely lady. I would really love to have my wallet back.
After a brief scuffle, he retrieved his wallet. She got out and left on foot. Bogan said that was the last he saw of her. The next morning, he noticed his pager was missing, assumed he had lost it, and called the pager company to report it missing. During the interrogation of Mark Bogan, investigators noticed scratch marks on the side of his face.
If there were scratches on the suspect's face, then you would expect that if those were in fact inflicted by fingers or fingernails of the victim, there should be some residue of either the skin cells and or maybe even blood under the fingernails.
The autopsy of Denise Johnson revealed no skin or blood under any of her fingernails. The medical examiner found that Denise Johnson's death was caused by asphyxiation due to strangulation. Blood tests showed cocaine in her system. However, there were no signs of any type of sexual activity. There was no semen found, no foreign hair, clothing fibers, or saliva found anywhere on her body. The autopsy told investigators how Denise Johnson died, but provided no clues about her killer. Their one suspect, Mark Bogan, was apparently a dead end. The sheriff's office had not only a murder, but a mystery. On the day after police discovered Denise Johnson's body, homicide detective Charlie Norton was assigned to the case.
I decided that it would help me as the investigator to go out and familiarize myself with the scene where the body was found.
Denise Johnson's body was discovered in a remote part of Maricopa County, about a half an hour away from downtown Phoenix. Charlie Norton was looking for anything out of place or unusual, anything that might have been overlooked the day before. Then he saw it, something peculiar on a Palo Verde tree, just a few feet from where the body was found.
I had parked my car on the pavement. I noticed that there was a branch that was hanging over, and when I looked at that branch, I noticed that there was a fresh abrasion, and I had no idea what it might mean, but I took a picture of it. Then I took some beans off of that particular tree.
Meanwhile, investigators confiscated Mark Bogan's truck to look for possible evidence linking him or his truck to the crime scene. It was completely clean. No fingerprints, semen, blood, saliva, hair, or clothing fibers. No evidence at all that Denise Johnson was even in the truck. But when investigators and police photographers looked in the back of the truck, they made an interesting discovery. They found 2 bean pods from a Palo Verde tree. Was it possible that Bogan's truck brushed against the Palo Verde tree at the crime scene, causing 2 bean pods to drop into the back of the truck? The problem was, Palo Verde trees are very common in Arizona. There are tens of thousands of them in the Phoenix area alone. But Charlie Norton's boss had an idea: to see if DNA testing could match the bean pods from Bogan's truck to the tree with the abrasion at the crime scene.
I suggested to Charlie at the time, I said, it'd be a real good idea if we could find someone, somewhere in the United States that is involved in DNA testing of plant life. I said, what the hell have we got to lose? Where are we going to go from here?
What's the number for ID?
Norton started working the phones, calling scientists all over the United States.
I've got answers like it couldn't be done to maybe it could be done, and that if it could be done, that the cost would be prohibitive.
15 telephone calls later, he found someone who offered some hope, ironically, just 100 miles away, at the University of Arizona in Tucson.
I saw that as sort of a public service thing that we could do, that we'd show some of this science is relevant to people in maybe a way that's not quite as obvious sometimes through agriculture.
Could DNA really show that one plant or tree was different from another, even though they were the same species? DNA is present in all cells of all living things. It's a little like a computer program containing all of the information necessary to create a living thing. All humans have different DNA profiles except for identical twins. In the early 1980s, Dr. Alec Jeffreys, a British scientist, discovered a test that made it possible to identify an individual's DNA profile. Jeffreys' breakthrough technique was first used in a criminal case in 1986. But plant DNA had never been used in a criminal case, and scientists weren't even sure they could figure out a way to extract DNA from the Palo Verde seed pods.
Well, we certainly use fingerprinting a lot in agriculture, but we've never looked at this particular species, this tree. Nobody has probably ever done much biology on it at all.
Prosecutors had circumstantial evidence linking Mark Bogan to Denise Johnson's murder, but they needed something more definitive. They knew they would have to prove that Bogan was at the crime scene, and the Palo Verde pods were their best chance. The scientists had no idea that their research would be the cornerstone of a murder case. The Arizona Sheriff's Department wanted to know if there was any way scientists could match the two seed pods found in the back of Mark Bogan's truck to the Palo Verde tree next to where they discovered Denise Johnson's body. But there were thousands of Palo Verde trees in the Phoenix area alone, and there had never been a DNA test on this type of tree.
We had to learn how to do the analysis so that we could say, do trees look different from each other in this species? Because what we wanted to know was not was this a Palo Verde tree, but could I match it to that specific tree?
Dr. Helen Jarvis used what is known as a randomly amplified polymorphic DNA technique, or RAPID. This is a less common test than RFLP, the one used in searches for human DNA.
One of the great things about RAPIDS is that you're able to know nothing about an individual species or type of organism. You don't have to have any prior knowledge about it. All you have to do is get DNA, and the method works.
The test begins by removing the beans from their hard outer shell or pod.
The seeds have DNA both from the mother tree and other trees that would have pollinated it, so we need to get rid of those and just use the pod material, which will only have DNA from the mother tree.
The shells are put into liquid nitrogen, making them brittle and easier to grind into a fine powder. A chemical solution is added and the DNA floats free, a sticky bundle of complex molecules. The sample amount of DNA from a seed pod is too small for analysis, so scientists increase the sample size by copying the DNA strand. They use a technique called polymerase chain reaction, or PCR. The copying process takes place in a DNA thermal cycler. Within a few hours, this technique multiplies the DNA millions of times. The DNA is then placed into various lanes of a gel with a dye added, and then subjected to an electrical field. Under ultraviolet light, it's possible to see how the electrical current draws the negatively charged fragments through the gel to the positive end at the top. The results resemble a barcode, the genetic fingerprint of a Palo Verde tree. These fingerprints enabled Helen Jarvis to make an important discovery. The two pods found in Mark Bogan's truck matched each other. And they also matched the pods taken from the tree at the crime scene, the tree next to where Denise Johnson's body was discovered. Every other Palo Verde tree tested had a completely different DNA profile. It was the result that investigators and the district attorney had hoped for.
It wasn't the criminal itself, but it was a particular tree that we had to identify, and in fact we had matched that up.
He was able to take the original samples, take a part of the samples from the pickup truck, determine that those two pods came from the very same tree. Then he compared those with samples from all 12 trees and matched it to a tree there at the crime scene. not knowing that the tree had the scrape on it to which he matched it.
But there were only 12 trees in the initial test, and the prosecution felt that wasn't a large enough sample. They needed to show a potential judge and jury that all of the Palo Verde trees in Arizona had a different DNA profile. So the district attorney sent Helen Jarvis pods from 100 different trees, asking him to prove that each had a separate and distinct DNA profile. And he tried to trick Helen Jarvis.
I did not tell Dr. Helen Jarvis that I had gone back out to the scene, had a deputy take a sample from the same tree, which had the scrape on it.
Dr. Helen Jarvis proved that each of the pods had a different DNA profile. And he also discovered the prosecution's trick.
I called him and I was a little concerned because, we could tell all these trees apart and so forth, but we put the sample back in and it looked like it matched one of these supposedly random trees that they'd gone out and done.
It's almost like a touchdown in the end zone. I knew it. I knew he had hit on it. Out of 20 other samples that he had tested on one gel, he hit and matched perfectly.
Police arrested Mark Bogan and charged him for the murder of Denise Johnson. He entered a plea of not guilty. But the question remained, would this new DNA evidence be admissible in court? No one had ever introduced plant DNA as evidence in a criminal trial anywhere.
We held a preliminary hearing before the judge only to review the scientific evidence to see whether or not it was evidence that was generally accepted in the scientific community as both valid and reliable.
For 3 days, without a jury on hand, lawyers and scientists argued whether plant DNA should be admitted into a criminal trial for the first time ever.
What all of the scientists agreed about was that plant DNA, like human DNA, was unique to each plant, and if properly tested, could distinguish one Palo Verde tree from another Palo Verde tree, and there seemed to be no dispute about that.
Judge Bolton denied the defense motion to prohibit Dr. Helen Jarvis's testimony, thereby allowing the DNA evidence to be admitted at the trial. In setting a precedent, Judge Bolton had made DNA history.
We were the first criminal case in the country that used a DNA comparison of plant material to as a piece of evidence.
Now, armed with the potent weapon of a DNA fingerprint, the prosecution went to trial, attempting to prove to a jury that Mark Bogan murdered Denise Johnson. What happened to Denise Johnson on the night of May 2nd, 1992? The prosecution believed that Mark Bogan met Denise Johnson at a phone booth.
Hi, how you doing?
They spoke briefly, and Denise asked for a ride.
Sure, why not?
Thanks.
They drove to a deserted location for what was going to be a consensual sexual encounter.
How would you like to have some real fun?
Bogan asked Denise if she would agree to some light bondage and tied her wrists and ankles with some picture frame wire and shoelaces. Some of Bogan's ex-girlfriends would testify that he enjoyed bondage, and another witness told investigators that she saw the same type of wire in the cab of his truck just a few days earlier.
No! No, stop it! No!
At some point, Denise Johnson objected to what was happening and asked Bogan to stop. Johnson got out of the truck and tried to run, with Bogan fast behind. Quickly, the situation turned violent. The two struggled in the open field. Bogan lost the pager he carried on his waist, which fell into the high grass. Bogan strangled Johnson with her own T-shirt. Then he dragged her body under some nearby bushes and left. As Bogan drove away, his truck brushed against a Palo Verde tree, leaving the abrasion. 2 seed pods dropped into the back of his truck. An eyewitness saw a white truck similar to the one Bogan owned coming out of the road leading from the crime scene, going through a stop sign and speeding off in the direction of Phoenix. The witness said it was about 1:30 in the morning. Bogan lived 18 minutes from the area, and his wife told police she awoke as Mark returned home just after 2 in the morning. Most of the evidence against Mark Bogan was circumstantial. The lost beeper, the picture frame wire, his interest in bondage, and the witness who saw a white truck in the vicinity of the crime scene the night of the murder. But the most critical evidence in the case was the plant DNA.
There wasn't a fingerprint, there wasn't a drop of blood, there wasn't a hair. There were none of those things that anybody could say were part of the victim's body found, must have been left by the victim on the defendant or on the defendant's property, or vice versa.
He had admitted to the detectives that he'd washed his truck the next morning. He got rid of all of the evidence in the truck except for 2 Palo Verde pods.
They needed evidence that placed Mark at the scene, because he did have a credible story.
As a prosecutor, I had a mantle of evidence that I wanted to place upon the shoulders of the defendant. The Palo Verde pods took the mantle by the drawstring and wrapped it around his neck.
Unable to challenge Dr. Helen Jarris's findings themselves, the defense challenged the evidence, implying the pods were planted in the back of Mark's truck. But investigators said the seed pods were found in Bogan's truck before samples were taken from the crime scene.
If I was going to plant evidence, I would plant something that I know that I could match later on and probably be a little bit more assured of a conviction.
The jury found Mark Bogan guilty of murder in the first degree. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole for at least 25 years. The appellate court upheld the verdict. Mark Bogan continues to maintain his innocence, and the appeal process is continuing.
I'm trying to forget this case because I'm the only person on the planet that lost to a plant.
It was something that hadn't been done before, something that was certainly very different from the routine things that we do every day as judges.
But I love my daughter very much. I love all my children. But it's something we just have to go through. It's done. I don't know what in the world that could have tripped him off to hurt her like that. I don't know. But I hope one day we'll find out.
Shortly after Thanksgiving in 1987, an intruder broke into the Tucker residence in Arlington, Virginia. It might have been just another statistic, but the crime committed that night launched a new era in police investigations. This is how DNA evidence and psychological profiling helped catch a serial killer and set an innocent man free.
Everything about her was very gentle. She was very soft-spoken. She just had this amazing softness about her, this human quality
44-year-old Susan Tucker was a publications editor who worked for the United States Forestry Service. She was spending the Thanksgiving holiday alone since her husband Reggie was out of the country in Wales on a business trip.
Neither of us could put the phone down. We kept saying, "I love you." And we said this over and over again. I don't know how many times.
But without explanation, telephone calls went unanswered. And neighbors noticed her bedroom window wide open in the cold November weather, so they called police. As they approached the front door, they noticed it was ajar. Inside, a woman's purse was lying on the foyer floor.
I arranged calling the Monday. Couldn't get an answer, just rang.
Tucker.
I rang again. I rang again. I don't know how many times I rang.
Susan Tucker's badly decomposed body was lying face down on the bed. She had been dead for 4 or 5 days.
Her hands were tied behind her back, her feet were tied, the head hanging over the side of the bed almost.
She had been strangled and possibly raped.
It appeared that the killer more than likely was inside the home for quite some time. I mean, it wasn't just a very, quick in and out type of a situation. Many of the drawers had been, ransacked, had been gone through.
When Reggie Tucker first heard the news, he was devastated.
She said, "Sir, I've got bad news." And I knew it. I just knew it at that point. And I just, my whole world just fell away.
Detective Joe Horgus of the Arlington Police Homicide Unit was quickly assigned to the case. His task wouldn't be easy. For one thing, the killer had been careful. He had worn gloves and left no fingerprints.
Yeah, this has been wiped clean.
It had been raining on the night of the murder, and he meticulously cleaned the area around his point of entry.
He's smart enough to know that footprints, which is what we would have gotten from that, would maybe come back to haunt him, which kind of tells you maybe some past experience on burglaries.
Police collected the sheets, nightgown, and the large sleeping bag which covered Susan Tucker's body to look for possible blood and semen stains. They found hairs on the bedding around Susan Tucker's body, in the bathroom sink, and on a washcloth discovered outside on the clothesline. And they gathered shards of broken glass from the basement window. Everything was taken to the forensics lab for analysis, but perhaps the most important clue was also the most obvious: the rope and knots used to strangle Susan Tucker. The police were convinced they had seen this killer's work before. 3 years earlier, a 34-year-old lawyer named Carolyn Hom had been raped and strangled in her home only 4 blocks away from Susan Tucker. The killer entered the Hom residence the same way, through a basement window, and tied his victim using the same knots.
And it's not a common occurrence, not common at all, to see victims killed by using ligatures to strangle them, ropes tying up victims. It's really quite rare.
But the Hom case was closed when this man, David Vasquez, confessed to her murder and was sentenced to 35 years in prison. Could he have had an accomplice? Horgus spoke to him for several hours.
And from the way he was talking and everything and answering my questions, I didn't think he knew a damn thing about Carolyn Hom's murder.
While Detective Horgus began his search for Susan Tucker's killer, 100 miles away in the capital city of Richmond, police there were investigating a series of murders shockingly similar.
The body of 35-year-old Debbie Davis was found inside her South Richmond apartment. She'd been raped and strangled.
In less than a month, 2 young women had been raped and strangled in their homes just a few blocks from each other.
In each case, there was a forced entry with the murderer entering by cutting the screens and entering through an open window. Each victim was strangled. Both victims were white, between the ages of 30 and 35 years.
2 weeks later, he struck again, this time a 15-year-old girl raped and strangled in her bedroom while her family was sleeping. All three had been bound, raped, and strangled with rope. The knots were identical to the ones used in the Arlington cases. Detective Horgus suspected that the killer of Susan Tucker was the same man who murdered Carolyn Hamm and the 3 women in Richmond. If Horgus was correct, a serial murderer was loose on a 100-mile killing spree. Detective Horgus believed the man who raped and strangled Susan Tucker had also murdered Carolyn Hamm 3 years earlier. Horgus also believed the same man was responsible for the 3 rapes and murders in Richmond, 100 miles away. The Richmond police weren't so sure.
I mean, they have 3 murders that were within a couple miles square radius, I'm guessing, or maybe even less, that, you know, and now we're trying to say that 100 miles away, we're trying to link something to theirs. It's like, hey, get out of here. I mean, this is a local guy.
Horgus was a man, he was the perfect man for this case because he was obsessed. He knew something was wrong.
Author Paul Moniz wrote a best-selling book entitled Stalking Justice. It profiles the rapes and murders of these 5 women and the history-making investigation which followed.
Joe Horgus is motivated by the hunt. He's not a guy who's obsessed by issues of right and wrong, except for his own internal moral compass, which tells him if there's an innocent man in prison, I don't care if we got the guilty guy, we got to get the innocent man out. And he was determined to get this guy.
But if Horgus was right, that all of these murders were connected, he needed proof. For that, he turned to the forensics lab, where scientists were examining the stains found on Susan Tucker's nightgown and bedding.
I found 4 semen stains, and when I analyzed the sleeping bag, I found 1 very large semen stain. I typed all of those stains.
The semen came from an individual with type O blood and a PGM1 enzyme profile. Although this matched 13% of the population, it also matched the semen found at the Carolyn Hamm murder scene. Next, they turned their attention to the hair found at the Tucker crime scene.
And there are characteristics, microscopically, that can classify hair into one of 3 racial categories,
which are Caucasian, Negroid, or Mongoloid. The hairs found at the Tucker crime scene appeared to be pubic and did not appear to be from the victim or her husband. They were positively identified as Negroid in origin. This was another possible link to the Carolyn Hamm murder case. 3 years earlier, at the time of Hamm's murder, a black male wearing a mask had raped a number of women in the same neighborhood. The masked rapist was never apprehended, and Horgus always suspected that there was a connection to the Hamm murder.
Actually, the same day that Carolyn Hamm's body was found, another girl, lady, was in her house, and this black male with a mask and a knife burglarized her house, got her, and actually he did some sexual activity with her.
The Richmond police and later the Arlington police both sought help from the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit in Quantico, Virginia. This unit has interviewed hundreds of serial killers to learn what similarities exist in their psychological makeup. They were able to predict a number of important things about the killer.
We get in and look at the behavior that's left by the offender in the commission of his crime. We believe that by looking at that behavior, we can interpret the type of offender that may have committed the crime.
The fact that the strangler attacked his victims in their homes suggested that he had stalked them first and knew precisely when to strike. The FBI concluded that the perpetrator was between the age of 18 and 30, the quiet type, a loner who held a menial job. He probably had a troubled relationship with his mother and began his crime spree with arson. Historically, many serial rapists and murderers begin with arson. Serial killers are usually white, but could be any race. He lived or worked close to where he committed his first crimes. That's because criminals begin their crime sprees in an area where they feel most comfortable. He took sadistic pleasure in strangling his victims. He would periodically release the bindings so he could hear his victim plead for her life.
It appeared that the perpetrator had intended the victim to suffer considerably. In one case, a shoe impression was found on the victim's back.
These women were obviously first just terrified to the very bone, and then were systematically sexually assaulted, and you know, at the end, and it's not clear whether they were dead when he did this or alive, but he also masturbated on his victims.
And it was these semen samples which would prove to be extremely important pieces of evidence.
I can remember our prosecutor, Helen Fahey, a couple of days after the murder, asking me if this was going to be a DNA case. And I'm kind of, I don't know. I mean, we don't even know what we had got yet.
In 1987, when Susan Tucker was murdered, DNA evidence was still in its infancy. The first time DNA evidence was used in a criminal case was only a year earlier in England, when DNA from a semen sample was used to convict a bakery worker with the rape and murder of two 15-year-old girls. Horgus decided to try this new DNA testing, sending the semen stains from Susan Tucker's nightgown to the Life Codes laboratory in New York. Forensic scientists were concerned that the samples may have degraded or been contaminated.
You basically isolate the DNA, you cut it up, you generate profiles or patterns, and you then generate these patterns on a piece of X-ray film. So it's like a picture of the DNA. And when you then compare these pictures and the components are the same in the two DNAs, that would indicate that they're from the same source.
The final results from the DNA tests would take up to 10 weeks, but Detective Horgus still didn't have a suspect. Detective Horgus suspected that the same individual who raped and murdered Susan Tucker and Carolyn Hamm 3 years earlier was the masked rapist who was committing crimes in the same area but was never caught. So Horgus drove out to an area of Arlington known as Green Valley, the area where the masked rapist committed his first assaults. The FBI told Horgus that rapists usually commit their first crime close to home.
If the first rape was the first rape for this guy, then he would have lived around there, and that was very crucial to me because I didn't know that.
And as he drove through Green Valley, Horgus tried to recall the names or faces of likely suspects, young men he'd run across over the years who came from that area.
And it just so happens that Detective Horgus started to focus on this one juvenile he had dealt with or remembered him. He just couldn't place the name.
And all I could remember was Timmy. I could see his face. I remembered the approximate time period and everything that I remembered him from, but I couldn't remember his last name.
So we were running all these names through the computer, seeing when they'd been locked up and released. And suddenly he just came in and he said, Spencer, Timothy Spencer, that's the name.
And I saw where he was arrested on January the 29th, 1984, which was 4 days after Carolyn Hamm, her body was found.
Spencer's history unfolded. In trouble as a teenager, he had a string of burglary convictions, and even more surprising, just as the FBI predicted, Spencer had first drawn police attention for arson, for setting fire to his mother's car.
He was presently in a halfway house in Richmond. Well, wow, that's exciting now.
Spencer was on probation, living in this halfway house just a short distance from where the Richmond murders took place. And according to house records, Spencer had been signed out during the Thanksgiving holiday, visiting his mother in Arlington, the week Susan Tucker was murdered.
The fact that he got out of prison 2 weeks before the first murders down in Richmond, the fact that he was available for every murder, the fact that he came to Arlington when he did for our murder.
And the FBI was correct about another important detail. Spencer lived in the area where the first rape was committed.
And that happened over there. And at the time, Timothy Spencer was living down here over this hill.
In his mother's house, barely a mile from the homes of Carolyn Hom and Susan Tucker. On January 20th, 1988, police arrested Timothy Spencer. Within hours, they had collected a blood sample, some of his hair, and confiscated his clothing for forensic analysis.
The clothing was scraped down for removing any debris, and once that debris was collected, it was taken to a microscope. Several dozen particles of glass were removed from the debris that was removed from his clothing.
The glass fragments were of particular interest to the police. After police recovered glass particles from Spencer's clothing, they were examined forensically to see if they matched glass from any of the victims' homes. One technique is called glass refraction analysis. By shining light from different points on the spectrum through the particles, the characteristics of the glass can be plotted on a graph, in effect measuring how the particles bend light.
If you stick the pen into the water, which is more dense than the air, it bends the light. What we're doing with the glass particle basically is measuring how much the light is bent in and we call it refractive index.
They compared the glass fragments found on Spencer's clothing to the glass particles taken from the broken window at Susan Tucker's home.
We were able to say that that glass that was removed from Spencer's clothing either came from that particular pane or that particular source of glass or another source of glass that had the same optical characteristics.
When scientists completed the DNA analysis of the semen stain found at the Susan Tucker crime scene, they made a chilling discovery.
And I remember pulling out an X-ray film from the developer and holding it up from these two separate cases and being bombarded immediately that the patterns I'm seeing are the same. I'm seeing the same profile on this case from one county versus this case from a second county, which says to me that the same person's involved in both of those incidents. It really gave you chills up and down your spine to see something like that.
Horgus was right all along. The semen sample from the individual who raped and presumably murdered Susan Tucker matched the semen stains from the murders in Richmond.
There were 7 hairs that were consistent with his. There was a glass fragment that was consistent with his. His family couldn't provide him with a complete alibi for the entire weekend.
And finally, Timothy Spencer's blood DNA was compared to the semen samples from the crime victims.
Once we got a sample from Mr. Spencer to test, we generated a profile that was the same as the profile we got from the evidentiary samples. We had a frequency of occurrence of greater than 1 in a million. So that means that only one person in a million in the population would have that particular genetic profile.
And starting with the first result, the blood type, it was a match, it was a match, it was a match, it was a match.
On July 11th, 1988, Timothy Spencer went on trial for his life. It was the first time in the United States where DNA evidence would be used in a serial murder case. It took the jury less than 7 hours to find Timothy Spencer guilty of rape and capital murder. He was sentenced to death.
I feel some kind of relief, but I'll never have my wife back. That's really the bottom line. Is I'll never really feel happy. I can't feel happy about somebody being guilty of raping and murdering my wife. I can't feel happy about that. So whatever anger I feel, I will feel till I die.
Death was pronounced by the attending physician at 11:13 p.m. There were no complications. Mr. Spencer did not make a last statement. Thank you.
Up until his death, I don't think that Timothy Spencer made the connection between semen and blood. I don't think he knew that the same DNA that's in your semen is in your blood.
Without DNA, it would have been impossible to convict Timothy Spencer. If he had committed those murders a year or 2 years earlier, he could not have been convicted. In fact, if this had been 1984 or 1985, we probably would not even have arrested him.
Some people ask the question, will DNA fingerprinting replace detective work? I don't think so. Susan Tucker left Detective Horgus, the crime scene, and Timothy Spencer left part of himself at the crime scene. But his name would never have come up if it wasn't for Detective Horgus.